while therefore he regarded the entire world as one immense body, and perceived that the head of it all, the royal city of the Roman Empire, was bowed down by the weight of a tyrannous oppression. At first he had left the task of liberation to those who governed the other divisions of the empire, as being his superiors in point of age. But when none of these proved able to afford relief, and those who had attempted it had experienced a disastrous termination of their enterprise, he said that life was without enjoyment to him as long as he saw the imperial city thus afflicted, and prepared himself for the effectual suppression of the tyranny. Being convinced, however, that he needed some more powerful aid than his military forces could afford him, on account of the wicked and magical enchantments which were so diligently practiced by the tyrant, he began to seek for divine assistance, deeming the possession of arms and a numerous soldiery of secondary importance, but trusting that the cooperation of a deity would be his security against defeat or misfortune. He considered, therefore, on what god he might rely for protection and assistance. While engaging in this inquiry, the thought occurred to him that many of the emperors who had preceded him, those who had rested their hopes in a multitude of gods, and served them with sacrifices and offerings, had in the first place been deceived by flattering predictions and oracles which promised them all prosperity, and at last had met with an unhappy end, while not one of their gods had stood by to warn them of the impending wrath of heaven. On the other hand, he recollected that his father, who had pursued an entirely opposite course, who had condemned their error and honored the one supreme God during his whole life, had found him to be the savior and protector of his empire and the giver of every good thing. Reflecting on this, and well weighing the fact that they who had trusted in many gods had also fallen by manifold forms of death, without leaving behind them either family or offspring, stock, name, or memorial among men, and considering further that those who had already taken arms against the tyrant and had marched to the battlefield under the protection of a multitude of gods, had met with a dishonorable end. For one of them had shamefully retreated from the contest without a blow, and the other, being slain in the midst of his own troops, had become as it were the mere sport of death. Reviewing, I say, all these considerations, he judged it to be folly indeed to join in the idol worship of those who were no gods, and, after such convincing evidence, to wander from the truth, and therefore felt it incumbent on him to honor no other than the God of his father. Accordingly, he called on him with earnest prayer and supplications that he would reveal to him who he was, and stretch forth his right hand to help him in his present difficulties. And while he was thus praying with fervent entreaty, a most marvelous sign appeared to him from heaven, the account of which it might have been difficult to receive with credit, had it been related by any other person. But since the victorious emperor himself long afterwards declared it to the writer of this history, when he was honored with his acquaintance in society, and confirmed his statement by an oath, who could hesitate to accredit the relation, especially since the testimony of aftertime has established its truth? He said that about midday, when the sun was beginning to decline, he saw with his own eyes the trophy of a cross of light in the heavens, above the sun, and bearing the inscription, "Conquer by this." At this sight he himself was struck with amazement, and his whole army also, which happened to be following him on some expedition, and witnessed the miracle. He said, moreover, that he doubted within himself what the import of this apparition could be, and while he continued to ponder and reason on its meaning, night imperceptibly drew on, and in his sleep the Christ of God appeared to him with the same sign which he had seen in the heavens, and commanded him to procure a standard made in the likeness of that sign, and to use it as a safeguard in all engagements with his enemies. At dawn of day he arose, and communicated the secret to his friends, and then calling together the workers in gold and precious stones, he sat in the midst of them, and described to them the figure of the sign he had seen, bidding them represent it in gold and precious stones. And this representation I myself have had an opportunity of seeing. Now it was made in the following manner. A long spear, overlaid with gold, formed the figure of the cross by means of a piece transversely laid over it. On the top of the whole was fixed a crown, formed by the intertexture of gold and precious stones, and on this 2 letters indicating the name of Christ symbolized the Savior's title by means of its first characters, the letter P being intersected by X, exactly in its center. And these letters the emperor was in the habit of wearing on his helmet at a later period. From the transverse piece which crossed the spear was suspended a kind of streamer of purple cloth, covered with a profuse embroidery of most brilliant precious stones, and which, being also richly interlaced with gold, presented an indescribable degree of beauty to the beholder. This banner was of a square form, and the upright staff, which in its full extent was of a great length, bore a golden half-length portrait of the pious emperor and his children on its upper part, beneath the trophy of the cross, and immediately above the embroidered streamer. The emperor constantly made use of this salutary sign as a safeguard against every adverse and hostile power, and commanded that others similar to it should be carried at the head of all his armies. So for the past few weeks, I've been somewhat engrossed with the figure and legacy of Constantine and all the ramifications that this figure and the whole notorious series of events had on Christianity and just world history as a whole, and the history of empire, eschatology. It's just amazing. I actually wound up reading all 4 books of Eusebius's Life of Constantine, which I never actually read, and it's absolutely fascinating. And I'd argue is pretty crucial in understanding the broader context of so many things, so many of the different discussions and debates about church history, just overall, that many people are familiar with, particularly as it comes to Catholicism, whether you're talking about Roman Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy. It's all part of the same story of Constantine. And just reading the overall history of Constantine by his court biographer, when you read this account, there's no denying that Eusebius was the social media manager for Constantine. It's one heck of a piece of propaganda, let's put it that way. But, of course, all with very profound theological implications. But then you start to also put a lot of things, I think, in their real context when it comes to things like church history and the so-called church fathers and all the ecumenical councils that everyone refers to so much. Understanding the real context that those councils are happening in all starts with Constantine, with the Council of Nicaea. It all goes back to this story that gets turned into a myth, this account of the first Christian emperor. It is difficult to overstate how much the Catholic Church elevated Constantine to essentially the level of an apostle, like a 13th apostle. And it's an indispensable part of their entire foundational narrative. You can't justify Catholicism or Orthodoxy without accepting the teaching that Constantine did indeed receive this divine appearance of Jesus and the sign of the Chi-Rho and the standard. And so, skipping ahead a little bit in Life of Constantine by Eusebius, most of us are familiar with the story of the victory over his enemies at the bridge, and it's usually kind of portrayed as though, yeah, he has the vision like in the battlefield the same day, when clearly when you read the account, it was like, no, that was all beforehand, and he'd spent a lot of time building this golden spear with jewels and the crown. You know, it wasn't something they threw together on the battlefield. It was quite the trophy. Some would say idol. But not only does he see the vision of the sign of the cross, the Chi-Rho, in the sky, Jesus appeared to him in person and explained the whole thing, and what Jesus had to say was, here you go, here's the symbol that will defeat any enemy who marches against you. That's what Jesus had to say. Okay. And so most of us know the story about the battle at the bridge, and Constantine wins. That's about all we learn, honestly. But then, so skipping ahead, where Eusebius is talking about Constantine's entry into Rome. So this is chapter 39. Having then at this time sung these and such like praises to God, the ruler of all and the author of victory, after the example of his great servant Moses, Constantine entered the imperial city in triumph. So yeah, Eusebius compares him to Moses. And here the whole body of the Senate and others of rank and distinction in the city, freed as it were from the restraint of a prison, along with the whole Roman populace, their countenances expressive of the gladness of their hearts, received him with acclamations and excess of joy. Men, women, and children, with countless multitudes of servants, greeting him as a deliverer, preserver, and benefactor, with incessant shouts. But he, being possessed of inward piety toward God, was neither rendered arrogant by these plaudits, nor uplifted by the praises he heard, but being sensible that he had received help from God, he immediately rendered a thanksgiving to him as the author of his victory. What a humble man. But then you get to the statue of Constantine holding a cross and its inscription. Wow. He's so humble, he made a statue. Moreover, by many writings and monumental inscriptions, he made known to all men the salutary symbol, setting up this great trophy of victory over his enemies in the midst of the imperial city, and expressly causing it to be engraven in indelible characters, that the salutary sign was the preservative of the Roman government and of the entire empire. Accordingly, he immediately ordered a lofty spear in the figure of a cross to be placed beneath the hand of a statue representing himself in the most frequented part of Rome, and the following inscription to be engraved on it in the Latin language. By virtue of this salutary sign, which is the true symbol of valor, I have preserved and liberated your city from the yoke of tyranny. I have also set at liberty the Roman Senate and people and restored them to their ancient greatness and splendor. He made Rome great again. Wow. Thus the pious emperor, glorying in the confession of the victorious cross, proclaimed the Son of God to the Romans with great boldness of testimony. And all the inhabitants of the city with one consent, both Senate and people, reviving as it were from the pressure of a bitter and tyrannical domination, seemed to enjoy the rays of a purer light, and to experience the renovating power of a fresh and new existence. All the nations too, as far as the limit of the Western Ocean, being set free from the calamities which had heretofore distressed them, and gladdened by joyous festivals, ceased not to praise him as the victorious, the pious, the common benefactor. All indeed, with one voice and one mouth, declared that Constantine had appeared through the special favor of God as a general blessing to mankind. The imperial edict also was everywhere published, whereby those who had been wrongfully deprived of their estates were permitted again to enjoy their own, while those who had unjustly suffered exile were recalled to their homes. Moreover, he freed from imprisonment and from every kind of danger and fear those who by reason of the tyrant's cruelty had been subject to these sufferings. I mean, who could object to that, right? So that is the whole context where, like, the very next chapter is him conferring honors upon bishops and the building of churches. And, I mean, I've just been fascinated by this whole text. And the whole story, the whole reality, all the way up till today. And just even reflecting on this standard, like the fact that it's a spear. You're going to turn the spear into a cross, or make a cross out of a spear. In some ways, I could just end the video right there. You know, like, that is enough to go ponder for like a week. Just think of a cross made out of a spear, and how that in itself is the introduction of a false doctrine, symbolically. But that's really kind of the whole significance of this point in history, this era where, like, okay, the guy who's received the magical cross sigil directly from Jesus himself, Joseph Smith. But yeah, so that is the context in a nutshell. I mean, there's so much I could talk about with Constantine. And his mom, Helena, who supposedly went to Jerusalem and discovered the true cross. And that's kind of where the idea of relics really takes off. I'm sure it was around before that, but it becomes part of the state, just like everything else with the church is an extension of the Roman Empire. But yeah, Eusebius is really trying to sell you on how fabulous this all is. I mean, he ended the persecution, he defeated Maxentius, who was still persecuting Christians, and who wouldn't be happy about not being persecuted, right? After almost 300 years, especially. Off and on. So, yeah, that's the real context. Almost 3 centuries of brutal persecution, and then you have this act of God through Constantine. So here we go. The emperor was also accustomed personally to invite the society of God's ministers, whom he distinguished with the highest possible respect and honor, treating them in every sense persons consecrated to the service of his God. Accordingly, they were admitted to his table. Though mean in their attire and outward appearance, yet not so in his estimation, since he judged not of their exterior as seen by the vulgar eye, but though he discerned in them somewhat of the character of God himself. He made them also his companions in travel, believing that he whose servants they were would be more favorably inclined to himself. Besides this, he gave from his own private resources costly benefactions to the churches of God, both enlarging and heightening the sacred edifices, and embellishing the august sanctuaries of the church with abundant offerings. He likewise distributed money largely to those who were in need, and not only so, but his kindness and beneficence extended even to the heathen, who had no claim on him. And he provided not money only or necessary food, but also decent clothing for the poor outcasts who begged alms in the forum. But in the case of those who had once been prosperous and had experienced a reverse of circumstances, his aid was still more lavishly bestowed. On such persons in a truly royal spirit he conferred magnificent benefactions, giving grants of land to some and honoring others with various offices of trust. To unfortunate orphans he sustained the relation of a careful father, while he relieved the forlorn condition of widows, and cherished them with special care. Nay, he even gave virgins left unprotected by their parents' death in marriage to wealthy men with whom he was personally acquainted. But this he did after first bestowing on the brides such portions as it was fitting that they should bring to their future husbands. Right, social gospel, Byzantine edition. Right? In short, this is where I was leading up to. So then it says, in short, as the sun, when he rises upon the earth, liberally imparts his rays of light to all, so did Constantine, proceeding at early dawn from the imperial palace, and rising as it were with the heavenly luminary, impart the rays of his own beneficence to all who approached his person. I mean, a line like that really, I have to admit, it kind of makes, because there are people out there that, when you look into Constantine and the controversy over his conversion and everything, of course, you will quickly learn that what a lot of the critics say is that what he did was merge. Yes, he made the choice of the one true God over the many gods, so he became just vaguely monotheistic. And who knows if Constantine really did convert at the end of his life and get baptized. I don't actually even have an opinion on that much per se, because ultimately that's between a person and God, and who knows. So my point here is not to even really deal with the question of what happened on his deathbed or at the end of his life, but we can examine the vision and the standard and the whole tale, the whole narrative, the whole mythos that was expounded upon for centuries. But when you look into the fact that, like, Eusebius even mentions the statue, and there's tons more that he gets into where he starts building all the different basilicas, and of course the Hagia Sophia, the original one, not the Justinian one. But he goes and builds Constantinople and a hippodrome and brings the obelisks, and it just gets more and more fascinating, just the entire account of everything that happened just during the life of Constantine. But before he moved to Constantinople, he had this Colossus statue of himself, supposedly holding the standard. So it's interesting that they made this recreation of it, supposedly, even though they only have like 10 pieces of the original that was discovered in like the 1400s. But it does say in the Count of Eusebius that he's holding this spear, which is also a cross. And then in the reproduction, they have him holding the orb, holding the globe. And again, historians have noted that the pose is more or less the same as previous statues of Jupiter and Zeus in the Greeks. So it's this whole question of how much of Mithraism and things like the Apollo cult, the sun worship, how much paganism was already being merged with Christianity in the life of Constantine. Even though, on the one hand, it looks good because the abandoning and destruction of all the pagan temples and stuff does actually begin with his time, but I think really takes off under Theodosius. And this is the whole thing, is that the first step during Constantine was legalizing Christianity and bestowing all these wonderful gifts. And, you have the treasury of the entire Roman Empire at your disposal. And again, it cannot be overstated how significant this was on the entire concept of the church, which Augustine of Hippo came in as sort of the theological social media manager. He was like the apologist for this new church-state system. City of God, the just war theory, spear with the cross. It kind of fits together. It's pretty obvious when you kind of really just look at it for a minute. But there you go. Eusebius comparing him to the sun and the rays of light that cover the whole earth and rising as a heavenly luminary. That's some prose of Apollo there.
Year after year, the clergy in Kiev went to church and prayed an elaborate myth about St. Constantine and his Christianization of the Roman Empire. Excuse me. The following hymn from the emperor's feast day on May 21st expresses the basic plot of this myth. This is the Stichira in tone 4. The all-radiant light and never-waning star, passing from unbelief to divine understanding, was led to sanctify his people and city. And beholding the image of the cross in the sky, he heard therefrom, "By this conquer your enemies." And so, having received spiritual understanding as a priest and king, you have mercifully established the Church of Christ, O Father of all right-believing kings, whose relics pour forth healing. O Constantine, equal of the apostles, with your divinely wise mother, pray for our souls. Now, this hymn depicts Constantine, the emperor, in 4 different roles. He is a convert who miraculously hears a voice from the sky and passes from, quote, unbelief to divine understanding. He is a Roman Basilius who conquers his enemies with the image of the cross. He is a priest and king who establishes the Church of Christ. And he is a holy equal of the apostles who intercedes on behalf of the faithful. So what I'm getting at here is that the liturgical services tell a very concrete and very detailed and very elaborate story about Constantine.
So from Constantine's Edict of Milan in 313 AD, where he legalized Christianity, it was only like 67 years later that Theodosius I would decree the Edict of Thessalonica in 380 AD. The point being that it was basically one lifetime from legalizing it to then, because what happened at the Edict of Thessalonica, it made the Nicene Creed and essentially Catholic Christianity the official religion of Imperial Rome, and everyone who didn't agree with the councils or the dictates of the new imperial church, i.e. the emperor, and everything was politicized and part of the state system. So essentially, effectively, they could be persecuted by the full martial power of the empire, only in this time in the name of preserving orthodoxy and opposing heresy. And, you know, they love to point things like the defeat of Arianism and how these councils, like so much of the time, they just kind of almost imply like, yeah, it was just all these bishops that just got together and debating the gospel and debating, but they kind of leave out the part about like who's financing the whole thing, who's summoning them, who's presiding there. And so the church-state relationship has truly begun at that point. Which is why I guess it's sort of ironic to me when you hear certain, defenders of Eastern Orthodoxy or whatever. You know, I've seen clips of like Jay Dyer talking about Protestantism being a big NGO in relation to, Christian Zionism and all that.
I don't even remember all the shit I talked about. So now watching this back, I'm like, oh, okay. Now I see why Protestants are getting mad, because I'm literally calling out their whole religion as an NGO. This is great. No wonder. Good. Cope and see.
Which are like valid enough. I get all that, but the irony is like the entire history of this system that you say is, it's like when you go back to Constantine, it's not even an NGO, it's just a GO. And so this is why ultimately I was just so blown away, because there are doctrines that even those who allegedly came out of Catholicism, the quote-unquote evangelical world, the Protestant world, who are totally bought into things like just war theory. And I think Zionism helps kind of provide a narrative for it, because they rejected the Rome narrative, but they still believe in that Augustinian, Constantine idea of a just war and empire and its own. It's just a different narrative for the same, ultimately the beast system. the Beast Empire, which when you read things like Constantine, eschatologically, it's mind-blowing. Not just even thinking about the fact that it's all hinges around this vision and a visitation by Jesus, which I don't know, maybe 20 years ago it wouldn't have stuck out to me quite the same way as it does today, where now the idea of like false visions and Satan appearing as an angel of light is not, either he's a liar, there's really only three choices. Either you think he just made it up, he's delusional, or God really came and gave him the sign of the cross, gave him the standard, appointed him benefactor of all of Rome and civilization, like a heavenly luminary blessing the world. Or something appeared to him and it wasn't from God. False Christs, deceiving spirits. Fascinating. I know which way I lean. But everything became politicized, is the point. Who even got to be a bishop and who wasn't was all politically driven. Because you could see just by the nature of this whole story and this figure, it's really the rationalization and the basis for claiming that the interests of the empire and the interests of God's people are one and the same. That's a pretty significant development, I would say. The whole Roman Empire has become like God's kingdom on earth. And this is what's really fascinating, is when we get into like the whole debate about millennialism, and then, all these people talking about Satan's little season idea, which is essentially just post-millennialism. But the OG millennialists, or the heavenly kingdom, like manifesting in an imperial kingdom, it really happened. And it actually did last about 1,000 years, more or less. And it's amazing. The idea of like the millennial kingdom happened in 70 AD. They're actually kind of bought into the same mythology, the same dream of an earthly kingdom on earth, but instead of all these patriarchs and emperors and popes, you just had Jesus. As if the real history isn't bizarre and fascinating. Like, we don't need to make up little Dungeons and Dragons versions of our own fake Tartarian Byzantine Empire ruled by Jesus and Nephilims, and I think there were Nephilims, but you already know that I think that's a little different. The truth really is stranger than... it's the quote-unquote mainstream history, which is obviously full of non-biblical... just even reading this aloud is kind of a lesson in showing that when you read the account of Eusebius compared to the Word of God, I don't just believe mainstream history because somebody wrote it down. You compare everything to the Word of God. Does what Jesus said to Constantine align with what Jesus says in the Gospels and the rest of Scripture? You decide. But when you get into it and you learn about Constantinople and how he turned Byzantium into the new capital of Rome and moved a ton of stuff, like the two Egyptian obelisks that were set up in the Hippodrome. And they also had this staff it was called the Serpent Pillar, which I was like, this is so weird, but apparently it was some like tripod thing, like it had a fountain or like something with water in it, but the tripod was made out of these brass snakes that coiled up together and then split apart at the top. But that part is broken, but the bronze twisted part is still there to this day in this park. But Constantine brought that too, and that supposedly originally came from the oracle at Delphi. And so it's the same thing when Catholics defend things like the obelisk at the Vatican, where they're like, it's a war trophy, it's the oldest relic in all of Europe or whatever, and that's a conspiracy theory that would have some sort of occult meaning to it. They will just rationalize all kinds of things. But Constantine already was, obviously. And you can kind of see how, like, from their perspective, it's like, yeah, but look at all this amazing things that he's doing. So what if he's still holding on to the one idol above all else, and that is the empire itself? So it's like, we're going to get rid of all the quote-unquote pagan idols and the pantheons, but the empire, that's, I think, the fascinating kind of realization.
I saw this plane come out of nowhere and just ream right into the side of the Twin Tower, exploding through the other side. And then I witnessed both towers collapse, one first and then the second, mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense.
On the 11th of September, in the year of 2001, 19 men murdered 3,000 people here in my country. Then that same enemy struck Europe, murdering nearly 200 commuters aboard trains in Madrid in 2004, and 52 more aboard London buses and the underground in the following year. The entire architecture of Western counterterrorism was rebuilt from the studs around the singular traumatic event. That made sense at the time. Our job was to keep our people safe, and the realm of terrorism, the specter of global jihad, was the premier threat to their safety. And so we went to work, and we assembled a global coalition, working with many of the friends that are represented here in this room today. And we destroyed the ISIS caliphate, we killed al-Baghdadi, and al-Zawahiri, and bin Laden, and we built intelligence and law enforcement systems capable of anticipating and stopping attacks before the public even hears about them. Every country represented here today has disrupted a terrorist threat at some point emanating from this source. Jihadist attacks and plots in the United States are down by 2/3 since ISIS's peak. The number of people killed by jihadist terrorism in Europe dropped by roughly 97% from the year 2015 to the year 2024. In other words, to a very great extent, our counterterrorism strategy has worked. The threat has not disappeared, of course. It will continue to exist, particularly so long as we tolerate immigration systems that imports these threats directly into our respective homelands. But this threat has been severely diminished. The world looks very different today because of it. You are here because your political leaders are being attacked, stabbed, and shot in your streets, because your businesses have been bombed, because your railways have been sabotaged, because your police officers have been beaten and burned. You are here because this is real, and it is getting worse, and it can no longer be denied, and it can no longer be ignored, because it is time to crush this evil forever. This is a distinctive and unique evil. It has always been driven by a hatred, above all else, a hatred for civilization itself. It is a revolt of the worst against the best, a revolt of the weak and the cowardly against the strong and the good. It is perpetrated by those who cannot build, who cannot create, who cannot achieve great things, and take their revenge upon the world for their own inadequacy by seeking to destroy those who can. This is what radical leftism is. It may wear various different slogans and ideologies across place and time. They can call themselves anti-capitalist or anti-imperialist or communist or anarchist or Marxist, but the fundamental character is always the same. It's always the same. It is a poisonous resentment cloaked in the language of equality and justice, liberation, an overwhelming need to tear down what greater men have built, to wreck what is beautiful and what is right on behalf of people who are only filled with ugliness and have nothing else to offer the world. Through violence and through terror, they once again seek to impose their ugliness on all of us. The old dogma was wrong. The old dogma was wrong. None of this is driven by idealism. It is not utopian. The world it envisions for all of us is small, flat, gray, leveled of all exception, drained of all that is good and noble in the human soul. The world it envisions is a world without courage, a world without creativity or ambition, a world without heroes or glory or great causes to strive towards, without a world without miracles, without myths, without men who rise above the rest to do incredible and extraordinary things. And the world communism envisions is a world without God. For these architects of revolutionary violence, the towering achievement of our civilization, for them, it's an unbearable humiliation, a reminder of what they cannot do, and a reminder of what they cannot be. So they choose instead to destroy. They attack pipelines, they attack railroads, they attack power grids and laboratories, the physical embodied symbols of power and invention and achievement. This is the nature of the terrorism we face today. They despise the West because the West is great. This is an international conference because we are facing we are facing a transnational threat. These are not distinct and isolated cells. They are interconnected networks. They do not recognize our borders. They do not believe, in fact, in the nation state itself. They coordinate, they communicate, they travel, they train, and they act together, sharing the same infrastructure, sharing the same enemies, sharing the same mission. Antifa militants and their comrades travel from across Europe and to the Americas to participate in each other's attacks, to funnel propaganda and training materials and target information through shared encrypted channels, moving through underground networks of safe houses and finance, and sustain their operations through transnational funds. And they work alongside hostile foreign states that share their mission, like Iranian proxy networks, who are increasingly intimately tied to leftist militant groups around the world. The Cuban regime's sprawling intelligence and ideological network helped to build the far left in our country and in our hemisphere, and it remains inextricably linked to the far left groups and movements across and beyond the West. Today's far left terrorists can raise money in one country. They can host their communications in a second country. They can receive training in a third country. They can recruit militants in a fourth country, and then together strike a target in a fifth country. And so we have no choice but to confront this menace together. We will either cooperate across our borders, or the terrorists will continue to exploit the gaps between them. Under President Trump, for the first time, the United States is building the infrastructure, the partnership, and the strategy to defeat the scourge of far-left terror. The President signed National Security Presidential Memorandum Number 7, outlining a comprehensive strategy to investigate and disrupt Antifa terror networks and their allies. Last November, the State Department designated 4 violent, far-left extremist groups as foreign terrorist organizations, and there will be more designations soon. In December, we announced rewards for justice, offering up to $10 million for information disrupting the financing behind these groups. In May, we convened the first counterterrorism law enforcement workshop, joining American law enforcement officials and their counterparts in our partner country nations together to map and develop strategies for dismantling these networks. It is time for the people of the civilized world to defend ourselves, to stand united against this encroaching darkness and fight for what is ours. It is easy to destroy great things. It is far more difficult to make them. The enemies of civilization are only capable of the former. They are only capable of destroying great things. All they know is destruction. But we have built great things together. We have done it time and again. We know what we must do, and now we must do it.